Alright guys, so yeah, as I previously mentioned, we just finished a meal and it was actually really great. And yeah, I'm going to take some time to explain what I see regarding food and the egusi soup that I had previously. So yeah, come with me as we go. So guys, we are now in the streets of Nigeria, where we finished eating fufu and egusi soup. So I'm going to give some reviews about the food. So this is where we ate the food. This is where we ate the food from. Now, personally, I feel like there are so many things that needs to be talked about regarding where we bought the food from. So I think personally, I think uh, we actually we discussed about the environment where we ate the food from. So yeah, I think there needs to be some improvement as regards the cleanliness of the area, because personally I feel if you are supposed to cook in a certain place, you should have some level of hygiene. There should be some level of good hygiene wherever you are preparing food that is meant for consumption by the public. So I think there are a lot of things that still needs to be done as to that department. So I think there are most people still they still prefer to eat in their home, maybe because of the environment. The environment we have sometimes could affect the way people think about eating outside, because look at it, in Nigeria obviously we do not have a very clean street environment. If you look at our street, it's look at the street. This is what we have around the street. So if you look at the street, it's it's a different thing apart from what we have in most of the houses in Nigeria. Most houses in Nigeria, we keep the kitchen, which is where the food is being cooked. We keep such places clean as we can, as clean as we can. And I think that basically is the difference. That is the difference between buying in a street food, buying in a street food place, and also in in your houses, cooking in your houses. So yeah, I think personally the fufu actually it goes through a process. There are a lot of process involved in producing the fufu and also the egusi. So I would like to explain how the fufu is actually made. I will explain how the fufu is actually made. So yeah, the fufu is actually made from cassava. It is made from cassava. You know, how do we plant cassava? Cassava is actually a family of the of yam. It's also, it looks like yam, but it's not actually yam. It's a tuber crop. It grows underneath the root. So the cassava itself is actually the root of the cassava tree. So the cassava itself is actually the root of the cassava tree. So when it's being planted, it's actually planted by when you want to plant a cassava, you cut the head of the cassava. I'm going to show you guys yam, how yam looks like, and how cassava. I'll just make an example from yam. You get, so I'll just make an example from yam to describe how cassava is actually being planted. So cassava, when it's cut, it's put into the ground. When they cut the cassava, they then put it in the ground, cover it with soil, and over time, within, I think it takes about 1 year or two for it to fully germinate. Is that right? So yeah, Elizabeth is saying it takes about 1 year for it to actually germinate. So as you see, this is the street of Nigeria. So it takes about 1 year for it to actually germinate. And once it does that, you start seeing the leaf and the tree. It sprouts out, and cassava it starts growing. So when it starts growing and after harvesting, this is when the farmer then takes the cassava. It could be used for so many things. The cassava could actually be used for so many things. But since we are discussing on FUFU, I'm just going to explain how cassava is actually made from, how cassava is actually made, how FUFU is actually made from cassava. So when the cassava is harvested, how do they harvest the cassava? I told you earlier that they dip the cut cassava, they dip it underneath, and they cover it with soil. So when it germinates, you see the stem. It stems out of the root of the soil, and once this happens, the cassava starts growing underneath. So what you've planted earlier on, it might grow into 3 tubers. It might grow into like 4 or 5 tubers. So when this happens, you they then bring out the cassava. They they cut the cassava, because like I said, you probably planted one cassava. You planted one cassava that was cut, or a spoiled cassava. You planted it. So from that one cassava, which acts as the seed, about 2, 3, or 4 tubers of cassava could actually be gotten from that one tuber that you've initially planted. So after that is done, the tubers that have been harvested would actually be cut, and once this is done, the cassava, the FUFU can now start to be made. So how is the FUFU made is what I'm going to explain now. Once the cassava is actually removed from the soil, when it's removed from the soil, they go ahead to peel the cassava. They peel the body of the cassava. You know how yam is? Yeah, so the peel on the coat of the peel that acts as like something like coat around the body of the cassava. The cassava itself is actually white in color, but there's a peel over it, a kind of like brown, a kind of brown peel. So once this is done, the cassava itself is then washed. Once it's washed, then the cassava is actually grinded. It is grinded. They use different kinds of grinding machines to actually grind the cassavas. So once the cassava is grinded, it is then taken and is left to actually is actually left to ferment for some time. It's left down to ferment, and once this is done, then the FUFU can now be made. So how do they make the FUFU? As they grind the cassava, once the cassava has been grinded to an extent that the particles are very smooth, it's similar to having a powder form, but since they've added water already, it's not going to be powder. So they've actually grinded it into a very soft particles. So once they have soft particles, these soft particles are now stuffs that what they do is they then tie up this grinded cassava. They tie them most of the time in sacks. Then they press them. What they do with that is to actually drain the water that is coming from the cassava. So when this water is drained, why are they draining this water? So once the cassava is actually, once this one that we have in the sack, it could be in any type of sack. So once the one we have in the sack is actually pressed, it is pressed, and once it is pressed, we have we have some water that is being drained away through the tiny holes that we have in the sack. The cassava doesn't actually escape through this hole. What actually gets to escape is the water. And so the water actually, most of the time, the water contains starch. And when you eating stuff like cassava, yam related, they have a high percentage of starch, and too much of starch in the body is not actually good enough. So this water is actually draining of starch. So once the water is drained to the barest minimum, then we can actually start cooking our our semo, our fufu, sorry, our fufu. So the fufu is actually made from the remaining part that we have from the cassava. So it is actually, you put a bowl of, you boil water. So once water is actually boiled, you know it's boiled hot, you pour in your cassava, the one you have left over after you drink the water. Once you pour in the cassava, you then you have to mix it, you stir it. You use a lot of things to stir. You use there's something we call a stirrer in here in Nigeria. So you stir the cassava in hot water, and once you do this, it becomes hard. It hardens, and once it hardens, it forms a solid particle, just like the fufu that we ate earlier. And once it is done, then your fufu is ready. Then let's talk about the soup we used. The food was actually eaten as fufu and egusi. So we need to talk about the soup that we actually used. So the soup is actually called egusi, and it is actually made from melon. It is made from the melon fruit. Melon is actually grinded. Once you have the fruit and it's dried, melon fruit. If you know melon fruit is actually really always soft. But once it is dried to an extent, it is then grinded. So once it is grinded, you have a sort of powder form of your melon fruit. And once you have this form, it is this form that is then mixed with a whole lot of other things, like you could mix it with palm oil. Palm oil is actually made from palm fruit. So palm oil, you mix palm oil, you add your seasoning and several other things. And once you add all these things, then your egusi is ready. And then uh, the egusi and the fufu is actually ready. And you just add any desired meat of your choice. In our own case, we actually made use of beef. We ate it with beef, and we really enjoyed the food. We enjoyed the food. So guys, so what I'm going to do now is give an honest review of the, after explaining how the fufu is made, I'm just going to give an honest review on on the food that we actually ate. So guys, stay with me as I get home to give you an honest review on the food that we ate. So guys, I'm back home. So so I'm back home, and what we're going to be discussing now is, I'm going to be giving a few review of the fufu and the egusi soup that I had. So personally, I think the fufu, as I mentioned earlier, I think the fufu was actually really great. The fufu was actually really great. It was better than most of other food places in the street, because in the street you have a mix, you have a sort of mix of you have a sort of mix of the kind of food that you could find. You could find sometimes you buy some food and they are not really what you want, but you do not have choice and you just have to go with such food. But that personally, that experience I had was actually really great. I loved the food, and it was really great. Compared to other food places, that place was pretty much better because they had everything sorted out. They have good customer service. They have everything you could ever want. And if you are looking for a fast food place, yeah, that place is definitely a place you could get to. But now let's give an honest review about the good and the bad. So I think the fufu was actually not very. It was too soft. It was not very rigid because I do not like eating a food that that is actually pretty soft. I always like it when my food is kind of hard, such that I'm able to hold a muscle of the food. I'm actually able to hold, not when you have particles from the food actually, you know, maybe scratching your palm, and at the end of the day, that just doesn't, it doesn't do the job. And I'm pretty much sure that everybody would agree with me that you would have to eat what you like. But sometimes when it comes to food places, you really do not have options. You really do not have options sometimes because you know uh, these food places are actually limited, and food places that actually sell stuff that I like are not that much. So most of the time I prefer to you know eat outside. But when I prefer to eat outside, I prefer to eat food that I love outside. Indigenous food, not food that are the modern day foods like the one I had, which is the rice and the chicken. So yeah, I personally think the food was very great, but then the soup. When it comes to the soup is what I ate the fufu with. So I ate it with egusi. So the soup is actually really great, but I think it's too much watery. There were a lot of water. There was a lot of water in the soup, and I think this could actually really be improved on. And I would look forward to that improvement. Having the soup being perfect is actually really what I would love to do. So I think there's a lot of job that needs to be done on the soup. So yeah, guys, that was my review. I hope you like that. But overall, I would advise you guys to get some fufu and egusi. Thank you.